Joining our broadcast now is political science candidate Yaroslav Telyoshin. Yaroslav, good evening. We are glad to welcome you live on Freedom TV channel.
Hello there, everyone.
Yaroslav, what do you think, taking into account, of course, all the new circumstances in which, God willing, the next round of trilateral negotiations will take place? How do you see it? To what extent will it really be possible to take advantage of this window of opportunity that the president of Ukraine spoke about? After all, as a result of all the previous meetings, real progress has been made both on military issues and on the issue of monitoring the ceasefire. As for political issues regarding both the territories and the fate of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, frankly speaking, on these sensitive points, the positions of the parties remain quite contradictory and different, and therefore there is no progress here. In your opinion, how realistic is it to actually take advantage of this opportunity that Volodymyr Zelensky is talking about?
Well, look, here I would be very cautious when we talk about a window of opportunity. Yes, we understand that the current situation in the world, if we're talking about the situation in the Middle East, is very dynamic and things there can change quite rapidly. Plus, there are so many unknown variables that the situation could change in a way that benefits Ukraine, or on the contrary, could complicate things for Ukraine in a number of areas, both in the context of negotiations with the Russian Federation and the American side, as well as in terms of the situation on the battlefield. So there are pros and cons. How will this affect things at the moment? Well, it's quite difficult to say. It's hard to say again because there are so many variables. It seems to me that even our American partners don't take all of them into account, those that could arise and those that are already present. Therefore, to talk about having a chance to control this conflict and yes, to use it as a tool to achieve one's goals, again, I have to say, damn, you need to be extremely careful. In this case, we have repeatedly seen how the American side has miscalculated in certain forecasts, which consequently has influenced and forced them to adjust their actions in foreign policy. Well, it's enough to recall their forecast in 2022 when they were confident that Russia's aggression against Ukraine would end up essentially with a partisan movement in Ukrainian territories because Ukraine would not be able to demonstrate and carry out systematic resistance to Russian aggression. Therefore, in this case, I would put it this way. Are there theoretical opportunities for Ukraine in the context of the situation in the Middle East? Undoubtedly, there are. Will Ukraine be able to take advantage of these opportunities? Well, here the big question is for our representatives and the negotiating team and the management system as a whole. Why? Because we understand that if these windows of opportunity do appear, which is theoretically possible, they will only be open for a very short period of time, and Ukraine should try to get as much as it can during that time. Is the Russian side also aware of the situation? It seems to me there is no doubt about that either. Therefore, in this case, we will be dealing not only with variables that do not directly affect us, but also with our opponent, who will also try to take advantage of this situation. So, indeed, there are windows of opportunity, but whether we will be able to use them for the benefit of Ukraine and in our national interests, that question remains open. Of course, as I said, much will also depend on how the dynamics of events in the Middle East develop.
Yes, that's very important. Isn't that right? No matter what anyone says, how the situation develops will determine the processes and even, yes, the location of the meeting. But now let's continue. I would also like to talk with you and discuss how the negotiation track itself might proceed going forward. Well, today I already mentioned the Kremlin, and just now we mentioned the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, and we will return to him again shortly. Yes, today Peskov said that the situation in the Middle East, even mentioning that the death of Khamenei, will in no way affect the negotiation track. Those are his words. Because, as he said, we will still do everything necessary. First and foremost, in the interest, yes, as he puts it, of the Russian Federation itself. And as he said, we are committed to the political process that the United States has initiated there today. Obviously, this is being said for the United States of America, but still, I want to ask you as well, Yaroslav, is it possible that the Kremlin leadership and the government of the Russian Federation could somehow find a way to use the current geopolitical situation in the Middle East to its own strategic advantage in the negotiation track? Are there any loopholes here, or is it not worth looking for them?
Why? Of course there are. Look, again, as we said, the situation creates new opportunities and new threats, both for Ukraine and for Russia. We understand that these threats are on a larger scale, but for now, let's not consider other countries or participants whose national interests are also present in this region. If we are talking about opportunities, we understand that, again, for Moscow, the key factor is to maximize its own security from the United States of America so that the United States does not take any decisive steps to increase pressure on the Russian Federation, whether through sanctions, tariff policies, increased support for Ukraine, and so on. In this specific case, if the government of the United States of America were to comprehensively, let's say, completely shift its strategic attention to the ongoing issues in the Middle East, this could be seen as being entirely in the long-term interests of the Russian Federation itself, from a geopolitical perspective. If the United States gets bogged down in this process, again, this gives the Russian Federation at least the opportunity to drag out the negotiation process until the active phase of the election campaign in the United States, thereby allowing them to breathe easy. Why? Because we understand that the role of the United States will become more passive. They will focus more on their own internal socio-economic and political processes. Could this be the goal, and could this be a desired outcome on the part of, say, the US for the Russian Federation? Undoubtedly, it could be so. But we also understand that this situation creates additional challenges for the Russian Federation. Yes, hypothetically, we are considering the possibility that in the near future it will be possible to resolve, or at least put on pause, the active phase of the conflict in the Middle East. In turn, the United States of America will get what they would like to achieve, which is the opportunity to present to President Trump and his administration as a victory for the domestic audience and for external partners as well. This will essentially strengthen the influence of the United States of America once again in the region, and will once again highlight Moscow's inability to play the role of a global hegemon and one of the key actors on the global stage, because they were unable to support their ally, their partner, regardless of whether we look at it in the short term or the long term. They simply could not provide support. Of course, this damages Moscow's authority, but here we understand that there is another factor at play. The Russian Federation understands perfectly well that based on the internal order of the United States itself, and I am convinced that all the actions of President Trump and his circle, which are projected into foreign policy, are nothing more than a reflection of internal dynamics and essentially the need for victory. And if they fail to achieve these victories in domestic policy, the Trump administration looks for them somewhere in the external sphere. That is, they seek the so-called tool of a small victorious war. And in this case, of course, Moscow, I think it is fully aware that President Trump and his circle might really get a taste for using such a tool. In other words, if something cannot be achieved in domestic policy, they will try to balance and compensate for it as much as possible through victories in foreign policy. And we can recall that there is the situation in Syria and there is the situation in Venezuela. Right now, we are talking about Iran. And as they say, if this tool yields results, President Trump's administration might really get a taste for it. And naturally, they will consider other possible options where they could achieve a small victory in foreign policy, which in turn could lead to increased direct and indirect pressure on Moscow. It's enough to recall the words of Mr. Dugin, who responded to this situation and wrote that we are next. Well, in this case, at the very least, even if it's not a 100% step, because of course it's difficult to compare Russia with Venezuela or Iran, but we can definitely say that this is an indicator of the sentiments within a part of the Russian Federation's establishment. Therefore, of course, this creates a certain psychological pressure on them. Therefore, I think they are fully aware of both the opportunities that the situation creates and the threats that it poses to them as well. They will also try to play with these and attempt to use this conflict to achieve their own goals. But again, the key question is who will outplay whom? Will it be official Kiev or official Moscow? Of course, we hope that the battlefield will be won by Kiev.
But really, Yaroslav, let's talk about who will outplay whom, and most importantly, with what means. Let's discuss the instruments of influence that Ukraine can use in the upcoming negotiations. In fact, this very question was asked today by our colleagues, the journalists from Freedom TV channel, to the president of Ukraine during his conversation with media representatives. How can we strengthen our position in the negotiations? That was the question. And here is what Volodymyr Zelensky answered. First of all, we are already strong because we made it through this winter. And Russia clearly understands that there was energy terror, but it did not break Ukraine. As for strengthening our position, above all, there are clear security guarantees between us and the United States. It is necessary for our partners to sign this. The document is ready, and with such a position, we will definitely look stronger. But what preceded these statements? At the same time, there were signals about possible shifts in the positions of the parties. In particular, the head of the president's office and member of the negotiating group, Kirilo Budanov, reported that the Russian side had agreed to accept security guarantees for Ukraine from the United States. He noted that this could become one of the key elements of future agreements. Let's listen to the direct speech and discuss it.
At the previous negotiations, the Russian side stated directly that it would accept the security guarantees for Ukraine proposed by the United States. As for the issue of territories, we are looking for a compromise between two completely opposing positions. We haven't fully found it yet. I hope we will find it. We don't have much time for this. In the end, we will have to state, either we find a solution and end this war, or we continue to kill each other, which we are doing quite efficiently and professionally. Kirilo Budanov, head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, live on the United News telethon.
We will find a solution and end the war. That's one option. But how can we really put pressure on the Kremlin, just like with the security guarantees? After all, they had an uncompromising position, but then they changed it. In order to successfully put pressure on them, what tools can be used and who can do it so that their position changes, including on political issues?
Look, I believe that there are enough tools to put pressure on Moscow. The key question always is their cost. And so far, our partners, both in North America and in Europe, are not ready to pay the price for those effective tools that exist. Well, it's enough to recall the 20th package of sanctions, which is still on hold in the European Union, despite the fact that they wanted to adopt it already and close the issue. And it could really be an effective tool for further increasing pressure on Moscow. In this case, this also applies to the United States of America. The US has the means for economic pressure as well. Another issue is that, of course, the US itself would also suffer from this. And taking into account, again, the domestic agenda within the states themselves, we understand that President Trump does not want to create additional pressure on his own economy. Therefore, in this case, I would say that above all, the key instrument of pressure is Ukraine itself and the position of the Ukrainian people. Why? Because as long as Russia cannot achieve its goals, we understand that there are a number of destructive processes within the Russian Federation itself. We also clearly understand that our partners fatigue with the intransigence and destructive behavior of the Russian Federation itself is something that can also play a role in increasing pressure on Moscow. Plus, we understand that paradoxically, time is working in Ukraine's favor in certain respects. What do we mean by that? We understand that on the one hand, this is wearing down the Russian Federation's economy, which is already not in the best condition. We clearly understand that in order to replenish the ranks of its armed forces, the Russian Federation is relying on contracts, which undoubtedly helps to reduce social tension within Russia itself, but at the same time hits the country's economy even harder and thereby depletes its resources. Plus, we clearly understand that paradoxically, time is also forcing some of our partners who still have certain obligations to the Russian Federation, are trading in certain resources that they have not been able to quickly replace or give up. Again, as the deadlines approach, this becomes yet another blow to the Russian Federation. In this case, again, if there are any preliminary agreements regarding guarantees, of course, the question of what kind of guarantees these are is very important, right? Because we have heard statements from Mr. Budanov, and honestly, that would be wonderful if it is indeed the case. Another question is what exactly is included in these guarantees, because in the public sphere, we have mostly heard about a monitoring mission and so on. We understand that a monitoring mission is hardly a key guarantee against a repeat of the situation in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Plus, we see that Moscow is quite unequivocal in its position that there can be no Western contingent or contingents from NATO member states on the territory of Ukraine. So the question arises, what kind of guarantees are these, which the Russian Federation already recognizes and understands that these guarantees from the United States of America will be effective? Therefore, I would put it this way. There are, of course, instruments of pressure. We understand that once again, Ukraine's intransigence is not only in the context of pressure from Moscow, but also from our partners who support Ukraine. This, in a certain way, puts everyone in a particular position and clearly, so to speak, signals that Ukraine is not ready to make unacceptable concessions or cross its red lines. This too is an instrument of pressure in this case. Plus, again, we perfectly understand that the dynamics of global processes are now so intense that the situation can change within short periods of time. And this also creates pressure both on Kiev and on Moscow, in fact. And here one can play on this field. Plus, we perfectly understand that the dynamics of the political process within the United States itself can also, in a certain way, work to Ukraine's advantage, right? On the one hand, we see that the Russian Federation is trying to emphasize that it is not withdrawing from the negotiation process so as not to provoke aggression from President Trump's administration against itself. But on the other hand, they are also in no hurry to conclude anything, not knowing how the landscape in Washington itself will change after the midterm elections to Congress, because it could change in various directions, and in fact, this could significantly affect all the agreements that exist between the United States of America, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine. Therefore, in this case, I would put it this way. Right now, each side has its own strategic goals. And in fact, each side understands that there are a lot of variables that cannot be predicted and is trying to strengthen its position as much as possible in the tactical perspective without losing sight of its strategic goal. If at least one side has some kind of strategic goal, or rather not even a strategic goal, but strategic approaches to achieving that goal, well, I have my doubts. Why? Because, as I said, the dynamics of the processes are incredibly fast, and it seems to me that every country, no matter what resources it possesses, even the United States right now, cannot predict many of the variables. And in fact, both Mr. Rubio's and Mr. Kushner's statements that there are certain constructive steps being taken to resolve issues and to reach certain points of contact. But at the same time, we cannot guarantee that we will achieve peace. This is the best indication that even they themselves admit there are limited resources for predicting how the situation might develop. Moreover, there is a large number of variables that could either benefit each side or create additional problem areas in the world, which would completely divert attention from Russia's war against Ukraine. In fact, we must keep all this in mind and again strive to be more competitive than the Russian Federation. Right now, this is Ukraine's main goal, to continue effectively resisting Russian aggression.
On international platforms, yes, whenever there is an opportunity to talk about this, we must speak up and not forget, because you articulate this clearly. Thank you, Yaroslav, that today this task is very important. This is one of the top priorities for the Ukrainian delegation as well. Plus, I would add, yes, as a point, that technical preparations are still moving forward, specifically in the context of the negotiation track. The first deputy head of the president's office, Serhiy Slitsa, stated that the ceasefire monitoring scheme is 90% ready. The military group still needs to hold a few more meetings to finalize it. This means that the infrastructure for a possible truce is practically in place, and the issue now hinges on a political decision. Let's listen and continue.
The rounds of negotiations that have already taken place show that we are at a stage where the military group has worked through 90% of the issues. We have reached the point where the remaining work that needs to be done cannot be completed because political decisions are required. The value of the military group's work lies in the fact that we now already have all the main elements of the architecture for a system to monitor and verify violations of a ceasefire, cessation of hostilities, or cessation of military actions, and these elements are even acceptable. Serhiy Slitsa, First Deputy Head of the Office of the President of Ukraine.
I actually want to bring in Yaroslav in this context, right? Well, I mean, it's clear that, how should I put this delicately, that in reality, this technical preparation, the technical aspects related to monitoring, the monitoring scheme for the ceasefire, which Mr. Kislitsa is talking about, will be needed precisely at the moment when certain decisions have already been made between the parties, right? But, I mean, we will be ready, let's put it that way. So what's important here? How should the Ukrainian side articulate things here so that, first and foremost, this monitoring scheme is more favorable for Ukraine? And the main question is still the issue of protecting Ukrainian territories. To what extent should this monitoring scheme today also be a top priority for Ukraine in the context of the negotiation track, in a leadership position, so to speak?
Well, look, undoubtedly this is an important issue. Why? Because if we are talking about solving complex issues, it is impossible to resolve them without at least taking small steps in, let's say, technical matters, which are not key, but can serve as possible tools for achieving and resolving certain problems. The fact that there is constructiveness and progress in technical matters is wonderful. We understand that, again, achieving monitoring and implementing effective monitoring can truly be a good tool to prevent a recurrence of escalation along the line of demarcation. But in this case, when we consider the negotiation track in the context of security and the negotiation track in the context of political issues, I would, still remember here that above all, the political component is the most important. Why? Because if we compare and, let's say, draw parallels with our everyday life, then the political and technical components of the negotiation track are roughly like how we, as citizens of Ukraine, plan our day for tomorrow. We've planned everything perfectly, down to the minute, written it all out. When we do the laundry, when we clean, when we vacuum, when, I don't know, we cook at home. And then at some point, yes, we've completed 100% of our technical tasks. Then the political factor comes into play. A new, updated electricity supply schedule for the next day appears, which completely changes all the technical preparations we've made. So, in this case, is it a positive thing that there are steps being taken on the technical side? Undoubtedly, yes, but we understand that they will only work once the political part is agreed upon. In turn, in this case, we see a rather significant confrontation and lack of coordination between Kyiv and Moscow. Here we see that Kyiv is trying to promote its narrative, and perhaps now, due to the situation in the Middle East, things are even developing in a favorable way for them to try to achieve their goals. This is an attempt to organize a trilateral meeting at the highest leadership level of these countries, right? That is, we're talking about a meeting of the three presidents. Whether this will work out or not, again, we understand that the Ukrainian side, based on statements from President Zelensky, Mr. Kislitsia, and others, is now betting on this. Whether it will work out or not will again depend largely on the dynamics of the situation in the Middle East and on the internal political dynamics within the United States itself. Do they see this as a potentially effective tool? But judging by the statements and the fairly systematic, clear position of official Kyiv, yes. In my opinion, it's quite difficult to say whether this is truly a successful and necessary tool or not, because we understand that, of course, Washington is pursuing its own interests. And in this case, if Washington does not see its own interests in this meeting, and of course, the issue of resolving Russia's war against Ukraine will not actually be the first question that interests the White House and Washington as a whole, then we understand that naturally such a meeting will not take place. For our part, well, we will see how the situation develops. In this case, again, it is quite difficult to say in the short term how things will turn out. But I think that more or less the situation both in the Middle East and as a result regarding the negotiation track will become clear and understandable in the near future. We're not talking about weeks here, but possibly 1 week, two at most.
Yaroslav, thank you so much for finding the time to join us live today. Yaroslav Teleshin, candidate of political sciences, was a guest on the live broadcast on Freedom TV channel.